Hey folks, so I've spoken here before about some interesting dynamics about rivalries that exist in the Middle East that don't necessarily have to do with Israel. The Arab states, the Muslim states, are in fact quite, I wouldn't say outright hostile, but almost hostile to one another. And I want to tell you today about a very specific fight that not many know about, what it signifies and what it means, that exists between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So we have Qatar marked here on the map, and Saudi Arabia is, of course, this huge blob. So I've spoken here before about how the two don't really get along, and today I want to highlight that in a different way. As you probably know, the famous news channel that Qatar runs and operates is called Al Jazeera, right? Al Jazeera is a Qatari-owned news station. It's, in a sense, the Muslim news station. And I want to tell you something interesting about it. What does the name Al Jazeera, what does it mean? Well, Al Jazeera in Arabic means the island, okay? But it can also mean something quite different. It can also mean, in Arabic, the peninsula, okay? So if you look at Qatar, you would notice, of course, that it is a peninsula. But when people in Arabic, when they say Al Jazeera, they don't mean the Qatari peninsula. What they mean is the Arab peninsula, as we call it in English, like this entire thing. Now, just by the name Al Jazeera, we can see that the station tries, or at least hints at, being the voice of the Arabs, the voice of the birthplace of Islam, being the representative. Now, the curious thing is that Saudi Arabia also has a news network, which opened later, I think in about 2003. And they also have a news network that pushes their own narrative. And what's the Saudi news station called? You're gonna love this. The Saudi news station is called Al Arabiya, or in other words, the Arab, right? So in Arabic, the Arab Peninsula is named Al Jazeera Al Arabiya, and the news station are Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. Like the two of them together represent the entire Arab world. But by the name, we can infer that each station claims to represent the Arab world. Okay, but they're pushing opposing narratives. I'll give you an example of an opposing narrative. When the invasion of Iraq happened, Al Jazeera started blasting away with footage of dying civilians. And of course, this was not good for Washington, but not only was it bad for Washington, it was also bad for Riyadh, for the Saudi Arabian capital. Why? Because Saudi Arabia wanted Saddam Hussein to fall. And so the Saudis launched Al Arabiya back in 2003, I believe it was. And then what we had happen was that we have two news stations. Each claims to represent the Arab view, but they're opposed ideologically, because the Qatari one, Al Jazeera, pushes the Qatari narrative, while the Saudi one, Al Arabiya, pushes the Saudi narrative. And the narratives differ because Qatar is a Muslim Brotherhood influenced nation that would like Islamist factions to rise and maybe even take over and topple the so-called moderate governments of the Arab world, like those in Saudi Arabia, those in Jordan, those in, well, anywhere, Egypt mainly, I guess. So these are the two factions. And when the Arab Spring happened, when there were revolts all over the Arab world, it was the Qataris who hailed these revolutions as revolutions of freedom, as, you know, celebrating the toppling of the government in Egypt, etc., while the Saudis were trying to be more, well, some would say responsible and some would say protective of their own authority, right? So they were criticizing these revolutions more easily and trying to walk a finer line. We can have the same example if we talk about the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war in Lebanon, in which the Al Jazeera kind of took on Hezbollah's side, while the Saudis were, of course, critical of the Israelis because it's a national pastime in the Middle East to be critical of Israel. But also they were critical of Iran and Hezbollah for provoking this and dragging, basically provoking Israel into a conflict. So again, we see these narratives push against each other, in which Qatar is a bit more aligned with Iran on that matter, while the Saudis are, of course, rivals of Iran. Now, here's an interesting thing. Back during the Arab Spring, there were protests in Bahrain. Now, Bahrain is very much a neighbor of Qatar, you can say, and the government was putting down these protests. Let's just put it like that. And if you would follow Qatar's stance on all the other revolutions and protests, you would expect Al Jazeera to cover this protest and say what heroes they are. But this time, they were silent. That kind of exposed Al Jazeera's hypocrisy, right? Because once the instability comes to your doorstep, I mean, look how close it is to Qatar. Once it comes to your doorstep, you go silent, you go quiet, you don't criticize, you don't say anything. So that kind of said a lot and about Al Jazeera and really what it stands for, which is, many would say, not really a news network, but a foreign policy tool of the Qatari regime, essentially. And of course, we reach some sort of a climax in 2017 when the Saudis led a blockade against Qatar. It was this huge crisis in the region, and there was this blockade of Qatar. And of course, Al Arabiya, the Saudi hand, portrayed Qatar as a sponsor of terrorism, that it's time to pay the price. While the Qatari news network, Al Jazeera, portrayed Qatar as a victim of oppression and aggression and all these fancy words. Now, both, I remind you, the irony of the entire Arab Peninsula being called in Arabic Al Jazeera Al Arabiya, meaning the combined names of the two news stations who each claim to represent the Arab view or the Arab voice or the Arab interest or whatever you might call it. So in short, what I really wanted to demonstrate for you guys today is that the Arab world is not as united as you might think. And even nations who are not flat out rivals, like Saudi Arabia and Iran, or like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, which are still rivals but not as bad as Iran, or even Egypt and Turkey, which are kind of rivals but also not really. It depends on what Egypt needs at the moment. And of course, Egypt and Iran are rivals mostly, right? So these relationships are complicated. These are groups of authoritarian regimes vying for power and trying to keep the Islamists at bay because they know that for an Islamist, these autocratic regimes are basically corrupt and bad and standing in the way of Islamic unification. That is what they would prefer to have happened. And some would say that if you were to poll the average Arab in the street, you would discover, well, if you don't account for people being afraid to speak out because they would, of course, be imprisoned. But some say that the true sentiment in the Middle East is to unite as a caliphate-style nation, which, of course, would have to include removing the cancer of the Middle East, Israel, right? So they would have to obliterate Israel in order to achieve that goal, but they believe that someday that would be achieved by the will of Allah. And anyway, I just wanted to talk a bit about that and show you because I think it's kind of cool. So Al Jazeera Al Arabiya has the two news stations, Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, each pushing a conflicting narrative. I hope now you know more. See you around.